Have you ever gotten so locked in on a target, so focused on the objective that maybe, just maybe, you pushed a little too far? Well, today, we're going deep into Carl von Clausewitz's On War, and let me tell you, Chapter 22 on the culminating point of victory, this one really makes you rethink those moments when pushing ahead, when it feels like you're on a roll, could actually be how you lose it all.
It's great to be here. Clausewitz, he had a way of getting right to the heart of military strategy, and this chapter, oh, it's a perfect example. The whole thing is about recognizing that victory, it isn't some straight line to the finish, it's got a peak, like a mountain, right? And at that point, the attacker's advantage, even when they're on top, it starts to go downhill. He calls this the culminating point of victory.
Okay, so the culminating point, like where things crest, I'm hooked already, but paint me a picture. How does this actually go down in a real-world situation? Why should this matter to someone boots on the ground making those split-second decisions?
Imagine, just picture a lamp, right? Ordinary lamp. As the oil burns down, what happens? The light, it gets weaker, dimmer and dimmer. It's still shining, sure, but not nearly as strong. An army on the move, on the attack, it's kind of like that. Every win, each step forward, it takes something. Resources, supplies stretch thin, and sometimes it even opens up new weaknesses you didn't have before. So even when you're winning, you're using up the very things that got you there.
So you can't get tunnel vision on just the immediate objective, got to be thinking several moves ahead. What can cause this whole momentum shift? If you're a leader in the field, what are you looking for, both in your own forces and the enemy?
Clausewitz, he breaks it down like this. Factors that make an attacker stronger and those that weaken him. So let's start with what makes them strong. Enemy losses, obviously, then there's control of resources, and that psychological impact of victory. Sounds straightforward, right? The more you're winning, the more the other side starts to lose morale, feels like they can't catch a break.
Win-win, yeah.
Right. Seems logical. But something tells me it can't be that easy. You got it. There's always a catch. We got to think about how different those factors were back in Clausewitz's day, 19th century warfare, compared to how things are now. Back then, armies, they weren't always as big. Battles were more decisive. Lose a city, a key supply depot, that could cripple a whole nation.
But in today's world, with everything so interconnected, supply chains going global, and the nature of war itself changing.
It's a whole different ball game now. The resources that matter most, they might be tech, economic leverage, could even be information. Think about it. A win in cyberspace, it can hit just as hard as taking a hill did 100 years ago.
Feels like we're talking a whole new language of war here. Stuff Clausewitz couldn't have even dreamed of.
Right. Okay, so what about the flip side? What weakens an attacker, even when they're the ones pushing? This is where it gets really interesting, right?
Now you're talking. He talks about sieges, those long, drawn-out things, supply lines stretched till they snap. And get this, even alliances changing sides. Like, think about Napoleon marching into Russia, 1812, the whole thing. Talk about overstretch. Oh man, Napoleon's march on Moscow, that's legendary. Total victory at first, or so it seemed, and then winter hit.
And bam, he gets all the way to Moscow, winning battles left and right. But the Russians, they just kept pulling back, scorching the earth as they went. By the time winter dug in, Napoleon's army, they were spent starving, sitting ducks. It's a story they still teach. Reminds us that logistics, the ground you're fighting on, that stuff never gets old.
For sure. And shows you how that line between playing offense and defense, it can get blurry real fast. So how does this whole culminating point idea change the way we see that push and pull?
You're hitting on a key point there, how offense and defense, they kind of dance around each other. See, Clausewitz, he says there's this assumption a lot of folks have, almost instinctive, that defense, hunkering down, it's just naturally easier, less risky, right? But he's warning us, don't get too comfy with that idea. The advantages of defense, the terrain, being prepared, having the locals on your side, those things aren't guaranteed, especially not if you've been the one on the offense and maybe even stretched a little thin because of it.
So it's not just where you are on the map, it's the path you took to get there. Like whether your forces are worn out from a long offensive or if you're digging in after a strategic retreat, those are two different stories.
Bingo. It's all about context. Let me ask you this. Have you been kind of forced back, gotta get defensive after a string of aggressive moves? Are you holding on to ground you just took, maybe dealing with people who aren't too thrilled about it? Or think back to Napoleon again. Are you trying to hang on to Moscow with winter breathing down your neck? Clausewitz wants us to break free from those easy labels, offense good, defense bad, and think deeper, see the shades of gray and how wars really work.
Makes you look at those old war movies different, right? The ones where they're outnumbered, making their last stand, sometimes holding the high ground. It's not that it's some magical advantage. It's about understanding how you ended up there in the first place.
Nailed it. And that's what Clausewitz calls the illusion of defensive superiority. You might feel safe because you're behind your defenses, but if you got there by pushing too far too fast the enemy, they might just use that against you.
Okay, so let's flip the script. Say you're facing an enemy, and they're already in that danger zone, past their own culminating point. How do you take advantage of that, but without falling into the same trap yourself?
That's where judgment comes in, the real art of command. Clausewitz, he says, knowing where that culminating point is, both for you and the enemy, that's one of the toughest things to figure out in war, but also the most crucial. It's about understanding this. The further you push, the more exposed you become. He's telling us, don't get blinded by the early wins, by that feeling of we can't be stopped. Sometimes pushing past that point, it's where the risks, they start to outweigh the reward.
It's like that saying, right? Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. But here it's more like, don't let chasing total victory make you blind to the weak spots you're creating.
Exactly. You got to read the situation, see the enemy's weaknesses for what they are, and then hit them where it hurts, but without throwing everything you've got at it. And that's where really understanding history, strategy, even psychology, that's what makes all the difference.
So how do you learn to think that way strategically?
Right.
Are there any good stories from military history, battles or campaigns that really show what it means to recognize and exploit that culminating point?
Oh, tons of them. Clausewitz, he was a real student of military history. He studied everything. And he uses examples, ancient battles all the way up to Napoleon's time to make his point. One that always sticks with me, the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC. Hannibal, he's got this Carthaginian army smaller than the Romans, but he totally outmaneuvers them, surrounds them, just inflicts devastating losses. It's like the textbook example of tactical genius, right? Understanding the culminating point, using it to win the whole thing.
So Hannibal, he saw where the Romans had pushed too far, gotten overconfident, and he used that against them.
Exactly. He knew those Romans, they were so used to having the numbers on their side, relying on the same old tactics, they became predictable. And Hannibal, he used that, turned their strength into weakness. Classic.
Timeless lesson there, right? Got to be adaptable, think strategically, even when you're winning. But how do you learn that kind of sharp judgment, especially today, with everything so complex, so fast-moving?
Well, I'd say reading Clausewitz isn't a bad place to start. His whole thing is think critically about war. Question everything. Look for those ripple effects. Don't just react to what's right in front of you. Think about how each action it's going to echo, create new openings or traps.
Not just the battlefield itself, but how a decision might play out on a bigger stage. Politics, economics, what people back home are thinking.
Now you're getting it. And that kind of thinking, you don't learn it overnight. It's experience, war games, simulations, all that. And studying history, of course, the good and the bad. Got to understand the principles, how they've played out over time, and then apply them to whatever you're facing now. Because Clausewitz, he makes one thing crystal clear. There's no such thing as a guaranteed win.
So cracking open on war, it's not going to give you some secret cheat code to win the next battle.
Afraid not. What it will give you is a way to think. How to analyze a situation, even when it's chaos, and make the best call you can. Because war, it's inherently unpredictable, messy, always changing, right? And the way you prepare for that is by accepting it, by getting comfortable with not knowing everything. That's how you stay adaptable. That's where true strength comes from.
So to bring this home for everyone listening, many of whom are out there facing those uncertainties right now, what's the biggest takeaway from Clausewitz's whole culminating point idea? If they only remember one thing from our chat today, what should it be?
Clausewitz, he teaches us that sometimes the smartest move is knowing when to hit the brakes, when to halt in advance, even when it feels like you're on a roll. It's easy to get swept up in the heat of the moment, to keep pushing for that next objective no matter what. But real victory, the kind that lasts, it's about recognizing that peak, that culminating point, where the risks, they start to outweigh the potential payoff, and then having the guts to change your plans, adapt, even if it means holding back.
Knowing when to regroup, to reassess, that might be the difference between a hard-fought win and a loss you can't come back from. It's about seeing those little shifts, those changes in the tide, that can make or break a mission.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That awareness, that ability to make tough calls under pressure, that's what separates the good leaders from the great ones.
And on that note, we'll leave you to think about the ever-changing face of warfare, maybe with a little help from Clausewitz. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.